So, welcome everyone to the webinar. This is how to memorize the contents of a book. I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us here. I think you'll find this webinar very, very helpful. First of all, let's discuss what we're going to cover. First of all, how you remember. This is going to be a portion of the webinar where we discuss how your memory works and some various memory principles you need to keep in mind if you're going to remember things. We'll also talk about a memory technique called the Numeric Peg System. This is a really cool and fun to use technique that will help you memorize things when you have to remember things in order. And of course, sometimes you don't have to remember things in order, but you just need to memorize maybe 10, 15, or 20 or more things. This will help you do the same. But the extra benefit this particular technique has is it will allow you to remember things in order. I use it all the time to remember presentations. The third thing we're going to cover is the title of this webinar. It's really all leading up to how to memorize the contents of a book. And we'll have a sample book, which you'll see on my screen, and we'll talk about the approach for memorizing the contents. So a little bit about Iris Reading, if you're not already familiar. We do speed reading and memory training workshops. We do them online, we do them in person, and we usually do them for a mixed group of students and professionals. So sometimes we'll do this at universities or high schools. We also do corporate training, whether it's at companies. We've done this for employees of Google. We've done this also for employees at NASA. Everybody has to read, whether you're a student or a business professional. And reading, we kind of center and focus on reading, but of course reading is nothing unless you actually are understanding and remembering what you read. So that's why we also teach memory techniques. So if you're interested in inviting us to do a workshop live at your campus or at your company or organization, you can email us at support@irisreading. Or if you want to call us, just go to irisreading.com, click on the Contact Us button, and there's a phone number there. I'll also have my contact information at the end of the presentation here. And of course, we can also do these presentations, as you already know, online. So thanks again for coming out. Our focus as an organization is obviously, we mentioned speed reading. That's important, going faster, but it has to be balanced with comprehension. You need to understand what you're reading. And of course, you need to retain. So retention is important. These are the three areas of reading that are all equally important if we're going to be efficient readers. So I want you to keep that in mind. Today, of course, we'll be focusing on the retention portion. We won't really be talking much about how to improve your reading speed. You can go to our website to seek additional resources for that. Let's discuss our first topic, how you remember and how your brain works when it comes to retrieving and remembering information. The most important thing to remember is that repetition helps you remember. I'll repeat that. Now, why do I have a baby on this slide? Well, babies love hearing stories over and over again. They'll be like, again, again, again. Well, in the development of the brain of a baby, repetition is very important, but it's also important as we get into adulthood. So all of us pretty much know that. That's how we remember songs. You hear them over and over on the radio, or when they were popular, or maybe you had it on your iPod and you listened to it over and over again, or you were streaming it. The point is, sometimes you'll remember songs you don't even like because you heard them so many times. So that's a key. We're not going to go into too much detail on repetition because I think everybody pretty much knows that. Of course, repetition helps you to remember things, and babies know this very well. Another important thing is association. This is another thing people aren't always consciously aware of, but it's happening. The way you learn new information is by associating it to information that you already understand. And that's how memories form. And actually, the structure of your brain, down to the cell, we have neurons, and these neurons connect to other neurons. So they're associated to other neurons through these connections called synapses. Well, the network-like structure of the brain is all about association, and that's really how we remember things. So you need to keep that in mind as well, because these principles, repetition and association, are leading up to the technique we're going to use later on that will help us to memorize the contents of a book. Now, you also need to understand that visualization is very important. You ever hear someone say, try to picture this in your mind's eye, right? So try to kind of see something that isn't really there, but you can picture it. I'm sure if I asked you to picture an ice cream cone right now, you could close your eyes, or you probably don't even need to close your eyes. You can just think of, okay, I have a sense of what an ice cream cone would look like. So that's what they mean when you ever hear that phrase, your mind's eye? It's visualizing something. Of course, we could visualize things that are actually there, and of course, we can visualize things that aren't necessarily there when we picture them in our mind's eye. So this is another very important memory principle, visualization. And a good example of this, actually, I think all of us have had this happen to us. You will forget names, right? All of us have. You ever meet someone and they tell you their name and you immediately forget it? That can be very frustrating. I know that's happened to me. But here's the interesting thing. We might forget the name, but we'll remember that person's face, or we're much more likely to remember their face than the name. And it's because the face is visual information. The name is a little more abstract. And by the way, in one of our courses, which I'll tell you about later, we actually have content relating to tips for remembering names. We're not going to get into it in this particular webinar, but we do have some strategies for that if you're interested. So as we're talking about visualization, you need to understand that your visual recall is much better than your verbal recall. When I say verbal, I mean words. Visual would be something like a logo. You see on the screen here, the McDonald's logo. Companies understand this very well, that you don't want to just have text, you also want to accompany it with some sort of a visual. And McDonald's does a very good job of that, not just from the golden arches, but also to things like Ronald McDonald. And a lot of companies will do this. Another very important thing is exaggeration. Anything that is exaggerated is more memorable. This is usually the case. People like to tell fish stories, right? Because they're more impressive, but anything that's exaggerated will be more memorable. And actually, sometimes people, something will happen to them and they'll remember it maybe in an exaggerated way. Sometimes you might notice this every time someone tells a certain story, every time it's a little more exaggerated than the last time. So exaggeration helps us to remember things. And companies, again, know this very well. You will remember things that are weird. Why don't we have, insurance commercials where there's just a guy in a suit and tie and he just tells you very straightforward, look, give us a call. You'll save a lot of money on your insurance. It'll only take you 15 minutes and we'll provide you with great service. Instead, we get what? A talking gecko with, I believe, an Australian or a British accent, which to an American audience would be considered an unfamiliar accent. This all kind of falls into the principle of exaggeration, right? So again, companies know this very well. So we've discussed how you remember. And by the way, just to recap, let's do a little bit of repetition. We talked about repetition. We talked about association, right? These are two important things that help us remember. There's also visualization, right? Picturing things in your mind's eye. And there's also exaggeration. So again, note we're actually, we're doing what we're talking about exactly in this webinar. We're doing some repetition, some association. Of course, you're seeing visualizations that are exaggerated on your screen. These are all things that will help you to remember things. Now, let's discuss how exactly we would implement these principles, because principles are kind of, they're theoretical. Unless you have a technique to apply those principles, the principles don't really mean much unless you're able to apply them. So this is one way that you can apply these principles. It's called the Numeric Peg System. And I want to explain to you how it works, because this Numeric Peg System is going to help us memorize the contents of a book. That's going to be our third and final part of this presentation. But once you understand how the Numeric Peg System works, it will help you to memorize a variety of things. I mentioned earlier, I use this to memorize presentations, so I don't have to look at my notes constantly. You might use it for, I don't know, maybe you're an engineering student and you have to memorize a 9-step engineering process that is in a precise order. This will help you to do that. So how exactly are we going to implement this? The Numeric Peg System, the reason why it's called the Numeric Peg System is because each number is going to get pegged to a visual. So the first thing you need to memorize, and I want you to memorize this right now, is that 1 is the equivalent of a pencil. In other words, I want to visually associate the number 1 with a pencil. So you're going to stop thinking of it as a digit and start thinking of it as an actual, something concrete, visual. Now, of course, the reason why we're comparing 1 to a pencil, it just has the same, very similar shape. Same reason why the next number, 2, is going to be visually associated to a swan. Do you see the number 2 in the shape of the body there? I'm sure you can. There's a little curve at the top. So when I say 2, I want you now to memorize that the 2 is going to be associated to a swan. This is going to come in handy later. I know right now it's we're basically laying the foundation. Once we understand what the numbers are associated to, then we'll memorize. And by the way, we're just going to do 10 numbers for now, and I'll explain later how you go beyond 10. Now, number 3, if you turn your head sideways, the McDonald's Golden Arches kind of looks like a number 3 sideways. So when I tell you number 3, I want you to memorize 3 equals McDonald's. 4 equals chair. Now, I know some people might make their 4s like this. I usually draw a 4 like that. So the 4 looks like an upside down chair to me. I want you to memorize that for now. So 4 is a chair. By the way, I am going to quiz you on this later, so I really want you to put some effort into this. The number 5 is going to be a hook. This might be a little harder based on the image. You see the curve right there? It's the same as the curve right here. This is like the handle up top. So I want you to think of the 5 as a hook. Now, remember what we said about repetition. We're going to go over a few more numbers here, but before we do that, I want to recap and review and basically repeat, because repetition is important, to see if you could remember 1 through 5. So I'll do it real quick, and all you got to do, if you want to play along, and you can enter these into the chat box on the right side. If you're watching the recording, you can just do this in your head. I'm going to ask you a number, and you tell me what image it represents. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So the 1, as you remember, is the pencil. The 2 is your swan. We'll just look at them here. 1 is pencil, 2 is swan, 3 is McDonald's, 4 is chair, 5 is a hook. Now, why did we review these? Again, you know repetition is important, but anytime you're trying to memorize something, try to compartmentalize things. What I mean by that is, if you have to memorize 10, 20, or 30 things, maybe halfway through you do a little spot check to see, hold on, let me see if I got the first half, or maybe the first quarter, or the first third of the information that I need to memorize. And now that we've memorized 1 through 5, let's go through 6 through 10. I want you to memorize that 6 is the equivalent of a cherry. There's the top of the 6, the curvy part, and so just imagine a 6 is a cherry. 7 is a lightning bolt. Actually, you can picture a lightning bolt as just a series of 7s. There's a 7 right there. There's a bigger 7 right there. Of course, it would repeat. 7 needs to remind you of a lightning bolt. Again, this is going to come in handy very soon, so bear with me. Number 8 is going to be our racetrack. 8 is a racetrack. Even though it'd be kind of weird if they made racetracks with intersections like this. Although I think this one has a bridge. Okay, so 8 is a racetrack. Number 9 is a balloon, just kind of blowing in the wind. By the way, you don't have to remember that it's blowing in the wind. Just remember that 9 is going to visually be associated to a balloon. And 10. 10 now is our bowl and maybe spoon. Or it could be a plate and silverware if you wanted. That's fine too. So I'm hoping that you now have these 10 memorized, hopefully. And let's do a quick recap like we did before. Remember we did the first 5? Let's do the next 5, 6 through 10. So I'm gonna do this rapid fire because I'm assuming that you're playing along and you're understanding this quickly. If you're listening to the recording, you could pause it to take a moment to think about what it is. What's number 6? Hopefully you remember that was our cherry. What's number 7? Hopefully you remember that was the lightning bolt. Number 8, did you remember that was the racetrack? Number 9, that was our balloon. And number 10, that was our bowl or a plate and silverware. So hopefully you got these. And by the way, before we move on, if you did get them, great. We're going to move on, and now we're actually going to apply the technique to some information. So this was step 1 in learning the numeric peg system and how it works. So now it's time to associate. What I mean by that is you have to decide, what exactly do I need to memorize? And then you need to place these things in a logical order or in a precise order. So 1, whatever your topic is for 1, that's going to get associated to the pencil. 2 is going to get associated to whatever topic number 2 is. The swan and this topic are going to be visually associated. You'll see what I mean in a few moments. Every single one of these numbers will get associated to their respective topic. And again, later on I'll show you how to go beyond 10. So now let's get to the interesting part, how we're going to apply this technique. And we're going to apply it by memorizing the contents of a book. Here is the book, and you can see it's called Brain Rules, 12 Principles for Surviving and Thriving at Work, Home, and School by John Medina. This is actually a very interesting book. It's about 300 pages or so. And here are the table of contents, one of the first 2 pages you see in the book if you would open it up. And you can see here there's a chapter on evolution, a chapter on exercise, wiring, attention, and so on. And again, these are 12 principles for surviving and thriving at work, home, and school. So guess what? 12 principles. As you would imagine, we have 12 chapters. Or in this case, they're calling them rules. So rule number 12, exploration. Rule number 10 here, vision. What we're going to do is memorize each one of these chapters. What I mean by that is, let's assume that you finished reading this book and you have to give a presentation on it, or you're going to have a test on it, maybe among other material, and you have to, maybe your teacher is going to ask you, okay, what were the brain rules? And what if you had to remember them, or what if you wanted to remember them in the precise order? That's what we're going to do. We're going to memorize the contents of this book. So you see how I put, you see how I put numbers next to each one of these chapters? Actually, not numbers. I call them numbers. They're pictures, right? So we're thinking in a visual manner here. So chapter 6, rule number 6, is going to be associated to our cherry because the 6 is our cherry. 7 is our lightning bolt. That's going to be associated to sleep. How exactly are we going to do this? By the way, I simplified this because there's a lot of other content and information here. We're not going to memorize all these details just yet. The assumption is, let's say you finish this book, you understood and read all these chapters very well, and now you just need to memorize them all in a precise order. So what we're going to do is simplify it. So 1, evolution. 2, exercise. 3, wiring. These words that you see here are all coming from just the words you see here, 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 and so on. So, and as you can see, there are actually 12 chapters here. We'll talk about how to get to 11 and 12 later on. But you might be running ahead of me and already understand how we're going to do this. Number 1 is our pencil, right? And remember I said we have to visually associate the information. So we have to associate what? A pencil. Forget about the digit. Don't even think about number 1. The number 1 is an abstract concept. A pencil, I'll bet you could picture that in your mind. And then we need to associate, that's what this plus sign is for. That'll just mean association. We need to associate the pencil somehow to evolution. So if you're doing this on your own, basically you need to find an image related to evolution. Now there could be a bunch of different images that remind you of evolution, and then you need to associate that image to the pencil. So I'll give you an example that I was thinking of. Evolution reminds me of Charles Darwin. Now if you don't know what Charles Darwin looks like, he has this long and glorious beard. So here's a little picture of Charles Darwin. Now I got to associate Charles Darwin somehow to pencil. Now here's the thing. Remember we said earlier that it's important to repeat. It's important to associate. It's important to visualize. But there was one other thing that was very important. We need to exaggerate. So whatever image I come up with that associates Darwin and a pencil, it needs to be somewhat exaggerated or weird or strange or maybe even funny. So I'm going to imagine Darwin with arms made out of pencils. So I'm going to imagine that he's evolved into this, being that now has arms as pencils. Do you have that image in your head? You might even picture the legs as pencils too. So if you have this image, the way it's going to work later on, if someone was to ask you, what exactly is chapter 1? What was the title? What was it about? You would remember the pencil, and hopefully that would remind you, oh yeah, the guy that had a pencil, Charles Darwin, and Darwin would remind you of evolution. Now, of course, this doesn't work if evolution doesn't remind you of Darwin. If it reminds you of something else, you would use that image and somehow link it. By linking, I mean associating to a pencil. Let's move on to number 2. Chapter 2 is all about exercise. And the number 2 we remember visually represents a swan. So I need some kind of a visual that associates a swan and exercise. And there are lots of visuals for exercise, right? Someone could be jogging, they could be lifting weights, they could be playing a sport. There's all sorts of visuals associated to exercise. But we need to associate the swan because that's our number 2. So you might picture, this is the best I could do in the time I was putting these slides together. I would picture a swan working out with, it's maybe doing some curls. It's got some giant biceps. So it doesn't make any sense. Notice that. And you know what? It doesn't have to make sense. It's actually better if it doesn't make sense. You'll remember it better. The way this will work later on, if I were to cover up exercise and I just asked you, hey, what is number 2? What was chapter 2 about? The first thing you'll remember is swan, because That's kind of the easy part. The 2 looks like a swan. And then hopefully you'll remember this particular swan that was, definitely, hitting the weights. So we move on now to 3. 3 is McDonald's. We have to remember that the chapter was about wiring. Now, of course, because this book is, called Brain Rules, they were talking about wiring in regards to the brain, but your image does not necessarily have to include, neurons that they were discussing in the chapter and things like that. Wiring, what does that remind you of visually? To me, it reminds me of, like the wires of a computer, or you might picture, electrical wires outside. You might even think of barbed wire. So you have some kind of image related to wiring, and of course we got to relate it to McDonald's, right? Associated. So I'm just going to picture, McDonald's reminds me of French fries. I'm going to picture that instead of these normal wires, I'm going to picture that McDonald's has, with all their innovation, come up with French fries that can also be used as wiring because they basically last forever if you don't eat them. So we're going to imagine this for number 3. Imagine 3 is McDonald's, and that hopefully will remind you of the wiring for all your electronics in your home wired up through French fries. Number 4 now, we have to remember attention. Now, if you'll recall, the 4 is represented by our chair. So we have to associate attention and chair. Now, this is a little harder because attention needs some sort of a, visual associated to it. And a chair, that's very easy to associate. So think about when you're not paying attention. You ever have like maybe you're reading a book that's very, very, I don't know, maybe it's very boring, but you have to read it for class. Or maybe you're in a class and the teacher is speaking in a monotone voice and you're starting to lose your attention, your mind starts wandering off. I want you to picture a chair that has arms. And every time you lose your attention or start kind of drifting off, it kind of smacks you or it kind of like nudges you. I would picture it like smacking me in the head like, hey, pay attention. So you might picture a chair like this. This is how we're going to remember 4 equals attention. So you really need to picture this in your mind's eye to remember that 4 is attention. We move on to number 5. 5 is our hook. We have to remember short-term memory. I'm going to picture, hooks remind me of pirates, as you can see down here. And this question mark, this just represents the pirate who has short-term memory problems and he cannot remember where his treasure chest is. And at the same time, as you can see, this is not a very tall pirate. I'm picturing some very, very short pirates. So I need the short in there to help me remember this chapter is about short-term memory. So picture short pirates with short-term memory problems that cannot remember where they buried their treasure. Got that? Now, I know this is a little ridiculous and goofy, but this will help you remember things. And actually, let's do a quick recap of 1 through 5. Remember we said repetition is important, so we're implementing this as we go along. So if you want to play along, you can type in the chat box as we're going along. And those of you that are watching the recording in the future, you can just write this down on a separate sheet of paper and pause if you want. Let's start with number 1. I want you to just write down the word associated to chapter number 1. And I'll just give you a quick little hint, and you probably already got it. Number 1 reminds you of a pencil. That's how this is how we'll lead you down the rabbit hole to recall the memory. You remember 1, looks like a pencil, and pencil will hopefully help you remember what? And then we move on to number 2. Number 2 now, oh, and by the way, if you want the answer for number 1, that's going to remind us of evolution. You remember, hopefully, Charles Darwin with his pencil hands. 2 was exercise. And I just totally messed it up here. I was going to ask you what is number 2, but I told you what number 2 is. So we'll get back to that one and I'll quiz you on it later on. Let's do number 3. Hopefully you can remember what 3 looked like, and that will lead you to what? 3 is wiring. You should remember the picture of the wiring of your home maybe as French fries. And by the way, the image for number 2 was a swan that's like working out, or a bunch of swans that are working out at the gym maybe. We move on to number 4. Try to remember what number 4 is. Type it in the chat box if you're here live, or write it down if you're listening to the recording. 4 reminds you of a chair. And what was that chair doing to you? You remember? Every time you lost your focus, right? It kind of nudged you. So 4 was attention, right? And number 5, do you remember 5? That was our most recent one. 5 reminds you of the hook, which reminds you of a pirate. And what does that remind you of? Hopefully it reminded you of short-term memory. All right, we've got 1 through 5, I hope. let's move on. Now, number 6 is a cherry. You have to remember the chapter title was long-term memory. Or again, this was brain rules, so they instead of calling them chapters, they were calling them rules. So rule number 6 in brain rules was long-term memory. How are we going to do this? Well, we need something that will help us remember long-term memory. I'm going to picture a cherry with an extremely long, very long stem, sort of like this distorted image here. But I would actually picture it even longer. It would be like just like 10 feet long. Now, again, image doesn't make any sense. Probably will be hard-pressed to find a cherry with a stem like that. But just picture a really long stem. The way it'll work later when I ask you number 6, you're going to easily remember, oh yeah, the cherry with the long stem. Oh yeah, long-term memory. We move on to 7. 7 is our lightning bolt. The chapter was all about sleep. So how exactly are we going to do this? Well, to remember sleep, you have images for what sleep would look like. I want you to picture, when you're sleeping and you set your alarm a little, you're trying to be aspirational to wake up early, and you set it at 6, even though you have to get up at 7, and then 6 comes and you're like, I'm just going to hit the snooze button. Well, I want you to picture that you have a special alarm clock that if you hit the snooze button too many times, maybe after the 3rd time, you get struck by lightning. Okay, I want you to picture that. So this is going to remind us of, snoozing and sleep. And so when we think of number 7, you're going to picture a lightning bolt. And then hopefully that'll remind you of the topic of sleep because of that alarm clock that would strike you with lightning if you hit snooze too many times. We move on to number 8. And now we're remembering the racetrack. Now we have to remember that the chapter is about stress. So how exactly are we going to do this? Racetrack and stress. Again, any image that you come up with, by the way, the best way that I like to do this is, usually the first weird thing that comes to mind is what I'll go with, even if it makes absolutely no sense, because the first thing that struck you is probably going to be the most memorable. And if it doesn't make sense, that's okay, because if you understand that your brain will remember things better if they don't make sense or if they're strange, then you're at an advantage. So stress, how are we going to remember that? I'm picturing, the stress balls. When you're stressed out, you ever have one of those balls? Picture a steering wheel of a race car driver that is embedded with stress balls. Maybe he's stressed out about maybe that's not a bridge in the middle there of that intersection. Maybe that is an actual intersection. And these race car drivers are stressed out and they're squeezing these stress balls on their wheel as they're going along to calm themselves down because they're stressing out about crashing. Hopefully you have that image in your head. That's number 8, our racetrack plus stress. Let's move on to number 9. Number 9 is sensory integration. This one's a little harder, and if you were reading through this book, you would remember that basically this chapter is about how using your other senses, your sense of smell, your ability to hear, your ability to see things, touch, all your 5 senses help you to remember things. Now, think about what kind of images do we have for sensory integration. Your 5 senses all have, images associated with them, right? Your sense of touch is your hand, your sense of smell is your nose, vision is your eyes, and your ability to taste things, your tongue and your ear for hearing. So how are we going to integrate this with a balloon? I want you to picture a big balloon that is filled with these body parts, okay? And I want you to imagine that all of a sudden the balloon pops and these body parts just fall to the ground, okay? It might be a little disgusting. And actually, by the way, if you can make your images while you're doing this for yourself a little disgusting or strange or things that would, give you some kind of a reaction, whether it's like a funny reaction, like, oh, that's hilarious, or something that is, oh, that would be nasty, or that would be delicious. Anything that triggers something like that will help you remember it better. So I want you to picture a balloon filled with body parts. These 5 sensory body parts gets popped and they just fall to the ground. All right, number 10, last one. Number 10 is a plate or a bowl and some silverware on the side. And the chapter was all about vision. And of course, what visual do you have for vision? I'm sure you're probably thinking of your eyes, right? Or an eye. Well, picture a bowl filled with eyeballs. And actually, I wouldn't picture these eyeballs right here. I would picture actual eyeballs, okay? Even though that'd be kind of like, it would be maybe a little disgusting. Picture, some moist eyeballs. Maybe they got a little bit of blood on them. Maybe they're even looking around all over the place. I know that's kind of a weird, strange image, but hey, the weirder, the better. So we move on now to, what do we have next? Well, we've done 10 so far. Hopefully, you can remember 6 through 10. So we're going to do this kind of a quick little recap. I want you to, again, you can type it in the chat box or write it on a separate sheet of paper. Let's quiz ourselves for 6 through 10. Number 6, what was that? Hopefully you remember 6 was our cherry, and that might remind you of something. Hopefully. I'm going to give you the answer here. What kind of a stem did the cherry have? You remember that long stem? That should remind you of long-term memory, hopefully. And then we had number 7, which was sleep. Okay, here we go again. I gave you the answer before. Speaking of memory, I think I'm having some memory problems right here. Number 7 was our lightning bolt, and that reminded you. Don't worry, we'll do a test later on of this. Number 7 was our lightning bolt, and you remember that snooze button, right? Where you press it and get struck by lightning. That reminds us of the chapter title of sleep. Okay, number 8. I'm not going to give you answers anymore. Number 8. You remember the racetrack? And hopefully that reminds you of the race car drivers that were stressed out about that intersection. And what did that wheel look like? You probably remember the stress balls on the wheel, right? And then we move on to number 9. 9 was what? 9 reminds you of a balloon, doesn't it? And what does that remind you of? Do you remember that balloon? It got popped. What was falling out of the balloon? You probably remember the body parts. And the body parts all represented our 5 senses. And hopefully that reminds you of the chapter, which was a little different, sensory integration, but nonetheless related to the 5 senses. Let's move on to 10. This one should be easy, right? 10 was our bowl. And what does the bowl remind you of? The bowl should remind you of what was in the bowl. Hopefully you remember those eyeballs that were just glistening, all moist and a little bloody. Hopefully that disturbing image crossed your mind. Now, if you got all of them, awesome. But what if we have to remember more than 10? In this situation, we do. We have actually 12 chapters. We did not do 11 and 12 yet. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, that maybe, for 11, you would do like 2 pencils and something to do with gender. And 12, you would do a pencil and a swan and something to do with exploration. However, that is not the right way to go, and here's why. If we got to the 20s and you had 21, you would again have to use maybe a swan and a pencil, but backwards, and that would cause all sorts of problems. So let me show you a better way to scale the system. Again, this is the numeric peg system. The way you would memorize more than 10 things, and that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to remember 11 and 12 this way. You have to apply some sort of a visual rule or a theme related to the next 10 numbers, 11 through 20. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? This has to be something visual. And you know what? It can actually be anything so long as you remember that that theme or that rule applies to all these numbers, 11 through 20. So let me give you an example so you can kind of see how this works. Let's say, for example, that the theme is snow. Now, snow has a lot of different visual representations. It could be a snowball. You could just picture somebody walking through the snow. You could picture a snowman. Any of these things related to snow. So if you had number 11, what you have to do to remember whatever number 11 is, you have to use your pencil again as your image. Why? Because the number 11 has a pencil in this spot right here. And then you have to use the theme of snow. Now, why are we using snow? Because we decided it was going to be the theme of snow. By the way, your theme could be anything. This could be cars. This could be anything that you want. But we're using the example of snow. So if you had number 11, you would have to remember, okay, so we have to visually associate a pencil, something snow related, and something topic, whatever that topic is, related. And if we had 12, we would do the same thing. Swan, because the 12 has a 2 in it. Snow again. Why are we using snow? Remember our rule, our theme for 11 through 20 is snow. So again, we're using swan, snow, and whatever this topic is. Now, in this situation, you see 11 and 12, we have gender and we have exploration. So if we were using the theme of snow, we would again, let's do a quick recap. You're going to use the pencil because the 1 is in the number 11. You're going to use snow because in this example, we're using snow as our theme. Again, 11 through 20, you could use whatever visual you want for your theme. We're using snow. And we're going to now try to visualize something associated to gender. Now, when you think of gender, you might think of male and female, boys and girls. So I want you to somehow visualize a boy and a girl, and we could visualize them I was picturing them maybe in the snow, like there's like 3 or 4 feet of snow. You know how kids like to play swords? I used to play swords when I was little, but instead of like fighting with actual swords, they're fighting with swords that look like pencils, large pencils, and they're just kind of fighting, playing swords in the snow, a boy and a girl. Now, if you have this image and you were asked later on, tell me, what's 11? Your first clue would be, okay, 11 has a pencil, so I know my image had a pencil in it. And 11, the theme was snow. And then you basically are 2/3 of the way there. You just got to remember this third part right here. So you would probably remember, oh yeah, that visual of, a boy and a girl fighting in the snow with pencils. Now, this is why it's important to picture it in your mind's eye. This is not going to work if you're just like, oh, okay, yeah, sure. You actually need to it only takes like a second or two to visualize this. A boy and a girl fighting with pencils in the snow. And we move on to 12. 12, we would do the same thing. We take the swan, and the reason we're using a swan again is because the 12 has a 2 in it, in this spot right here. So we use a 12, the swan. And then we have to include snow again. And the chapter title was Exploration. So I would just ask you, okay, when you think of exploration, for me, the first thing I think of is Christopher Columbus. Now, you might think of something else related to exploration, but whatever image you think of, for me, I'm going to use Christopher Columbus, and I'm going to relate that to snow somehow and swan. So remember Christopher Columbus? I think he sailed in to the so-called New World on the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, those 3 ships. I'm going to picture one of those ships was a giant swan-shaped ship. Kind of hard to say that. Swan-shaped ship. Now, this swan-shaped ship, I want you to picture it sailing towards the New World. I believe he landed somewhere in the Caribbean, but I want you to picture that it's snowing in the Caribbean, which makes no sense, right? Because it's so close to the equator. But picture like that snow moving, that ship moving through snow, and Christopher Columbus exploring the New World in this swan-shaped ship. Got it? Hope you do. Now, I know we're kind of being a little ridiculous here, but that will help you to remember. Hopefully, actually, let's see if you can remember all 12, but in a random order. Now, I'm going to do this very quickly. I'm going to give you number by number, and I'm just going to space them out with maybe 2 or 3 seconds. If you're watching the recording, you can pause it to think of it. For those of you joining us live, let's see how many you get. I'll give you a few seconds in between to kind of think of it, okay? And I'm not going to go in order from 1 through 12 or from 12 going down. I'm just going to kind of jump around, see if you can remember them. So let's start with number 5. So write down what number 5 is, or text it to me in the chat box if you're here live. Hopefully you can remember number 5. And now we're going to move on to number 8. I want you to type out what is number 8? Do you remember 8? I'm not even going to give you the clue, but the way this works, if you're trying to figure it out, the number 8 reminds you of some sort of a visual, right? What did the 8 look like? And once you have that visual, that'll hopefully hook you into remembering the rest. Now, watch this. We've only done 2 out of the 12 so far. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little switcheroo on you. I'm going to make it a little more challenging. I'm going to give you the title of the chapter, and you got to write down what chapter number it was. So, the title of the chapter is Sensory Integration. I want you to write down the number associated with sensory integration. Hopefully you remember. And how about number 3? Try to think of the 3. The 3 reminds you of a certain image. That should remind you then of the chapter. Let's do number 12. Think about the number 12. So again, just to recap what we did before, the 12 has a 2 in it. So the 2 represents a certain visual. And then remember 11 through 20, there's a certain theme associated with that. So you have to think about the theme and what the 2 in the number 12 remind you of, and that should hopefully lead you down that path. All right, let's go on to number 6. And don't worry if you don't get it right away. Think about number 6. What does it look like? And then can you remember the image we associated it to? Let's move on to number 1. The 1 had a certain image associated, and what does that remind you of? Okay, how about number 4? Do you remember 4? What did that look like? What did that remind you of? Notice how this is all about association. And by the way, this is kind of like a little exercise for your brain. Don't be too worried if you miss one or if you kind of blank out. Sometimes it'll hit you. It might hit you later on today. Let's do number 10. So what did the 10 look like? And write down, what was that? Okay, we only got a few more here. Write down number 2. By the way, the fact that I'm bouncing around usually makes it a little more challenging. So, but if you did these visuals and you actually pictured them in your mind, and if they were, striking enough or weird enough for you, and also let's keep in mind these were visuals that I was providing to you. If you did this on your own, it would actually be a lot easier. You know why? Because you're coming up with your own visuals. So, if you're getting these, by the way, kudos to you because you're actually visualizing, weird things that I was visualizing when I was trying to memorize this particular list. All right, so we'll only have a few left. Write down what number 7 is. Number 7. 7 reminds you of something. What did the 7 look like? And then what did that remind you of? What was the chapter title? Okay, here's the last one. Number 11. So again, you take the 1 from the number 11, and then you got to think about that theme that we established for 11 through 20. And those two things were associated to some sort of a memory. Hopefully, you got it. Did you get it? Hope so. Now, if you didn't, I'm going to go through it real quick, and you could play along as we're just going to do this rapid fire. Number 1, evolution. Number 2, exercise. Number 3, wiring. Number 4, attention. Number 5, short-term memory. Number 6, long-term memory. Number 7 was sleep. Number 8 was stress. Number 9 was sensory integration. And number 10 was vision. 11 was gender. And number 12 was exploration. Now, I will have the slide. If you were wondering what those images were and things like that, I will have, if you're attending live, you are going to get copies of all the slides. And if you're watching the recording, if you look on the page, when we post this to YouTube, we'll have in the description, we'll have a link to the slides. If you're looking at this on our website, we'll have the slides somewhere on that page. And you could always review those images if you want, or if you want to look at them for reference. But if you got all 12, very good. Now, if you didn't get all 12, I'll bet if you went through them one more time and did those images on the ones that you missed, then they would really, really stick. Why? Because you did some more repetition. Now, what if you have to remember more than 20 things? Well, just create another rule for 21 through 30. What if you had to remember more than 30 things? You would create another rule. So, 11 through 20, we said it was snow. 21 through 30, maybe that has something to do with like cars. And 31 through 40 is associated with some other visual. You can really, really scale this up. And if you need to memorize more than 50 things, it's not going to be easy, of course, but you could actually make it easier on yourself and actually maybe even a little fun by implementing this numeric peg system. It's very effective. I wish I learned about this when I was in school. I graduated a while ago, but if I knew about this in high school and college, it would make memorizing information a lot easier. Speaking of which, think about all the times you've been taught by teacher or told by teachers or maybe at work, hey, you need to memorize this for school or for work. Memorize this, memorize that. How many times have you been taught, well, here's how you memorize something. This is the how. This is basically learning how to learn. Now, if you like this kind of content, we actually have an entire course filled with other memory techniques. And also, I mentioned that we do improvement with reading and how do you read faster and comprehend better. We have a speed reading mastery course. It's our most popular course on the website. It's basically a package of 10 webinars that are in a very similar fashion to this one. They're all anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes in length. They've already been recorded, so you can watch them at your leisure. And each one of the webinars helps you to either read faster, comprehend better, or remember information better. The first webinar is how to read groups of words. This will definitely speed up your reading. There's a variety of exercises in each webinar, kind of like the exercise we did today. Second webinar is how to reduce subvocalization. Subvocalization is that voice you hear in your head while you're reading. And basically it slows you down because if you're saying all the words in your head, you're only going to go as fast as you talk. Third webinar in this series is how to remember more through spaced learning. This is a concept related to memory. You space out your learning in an optimal kind of way. It helps you to remember things better. There's another webinar on essential eye training. The fifth webinar in this series is learning to read and remember visually. We do go over the numeric peg system in that particular webinar, but we also go over a number of other memory techniques. So I think you'll find, if you like this webinar, you will love that fifth webinar. Of course, you can skip the numeric peg system unless you want to review that for repetition. But there's also a webinar, number 6, how to sharpen your focus for increased speed. If you feel like you easily lose, if you have trouble concentrating, maybe you're reading a lot of material, maybe you have to read it for school, but it doesn't interest you. What are some tricks for forcing yourself to, or tricking yourself to pay attention? That's a great webinar if you need to improve your concentration. Number 7 is high-speed comprehension strategies. So how do you continue maintaining comprehension if you're going at higher rates of speed? Number 8 is the most efficient way to speed read the news. So if you want to stay on top of what's going on in the world, this is a great webinar to check out. And the 9th webinar in this series is advanced level speed reading exercises. So once you start kind of getting close to maybe a roof on your reading speed, how do you burst through that roof? Number 10, this is probably our most popular webinar in the series, how to read a book in one day. So if you have a stack of books at home that you've been wanting to read, or maybe it's not a physical stack, maybe it's a digital stack of material, this will help you move through that material much faster and more efficiently. When we launch this course, by the way, it's available at irisreading.com/mastery. That is actually a special link that we distribute only to people in this particular webinar. You can get this package of 10 webinars. When we did it, it was $25 for each webinar, and there's 10 of them, so it's a $250 package. We have a special for you if you're listening to this, the recorded version. We have it as a package price of $50. So if you're interested in checking that out, again, you go to irisreading.com/mastery. That is an offer that we're posting for a limited time. And there's one other nice little tidbit of information in there. We have a PDF that's a bonus, how to remember names. So it's outside of the realm of reading. Of course, it's a speed reading mastery course, but it's a lot of people that are interested in memory techniques. They tend to be interested also, how do I remember people's names? Because that can help you out. It's kind of embarrassing when you forget someone's name. So again, go to irisreading.com/mastery if you want. That's a great follow-up to this particular webinar. If you want to continue learning and improving your ability to read faster, comprehend better, and retain the information more efficiently. Let's summarize what we did today. Why? For the sake of repetition, right? We talked about how you remember information, right? And how your brain works to store and retain things. We talked about a memory technique, the numeric peg system, and how to memorize the contents of a book. So that's a quick little summary, and I've got my contact information on the screen here. If you have additional questions, or if you want to invite us to your company or your school or your organization, we've done this throughout the US and we're starting to do it now internationally. So feel free to reach out to me directly. My contact information is on the screen. And of course, that follow-up course, if you're interested in it, you can get it at irisreading.com/mastery. I want to thank you so much for attending today's webinar. If you like what we're doing here at Iris, please tell your friends about us. If you do not like what we're doing, I want you to tell all your enemies about us, okay? Because that'll show them. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.